we're going to move on to our next guest, presenter, Amanda Nelson. Now, previous student of mine when I was in Lease area. So Amanda is a Métis and member of the Marcelin Métis Local 113. She currently serves as the Prairie Spirit School Division's Indigenous Partners, Perspectives, and Outcomes Strategic Facilitator. I'd like her to say that a few times. And teaches Indigenous Studies 10 and 30 for Prairie Spirit eLearning School. Her topic today, and just a quick note on that one, I know Warman High School, we went from 13 students taking Indigenous Studies 30 to my last year when I was in 2020, I retired, we were up to 115. So, and that was student choice, take history or Indigenous Studies, and that's what happened. So continuing on, the topic for today will be reading for reconciliation. Participants will learn how to critically analyze text for misrepresentation of Indigenous peoples, consider the impact of problematic texts, and explore contemporary trends in Indigenous literature. A reading list for personal, professional, and classroom texts will be co-constructed with participants to support them in their reconciliation goals and journey. I give you Amanda Nelson.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Yay, okay, perfect. Hi, I'm Amanda Nelson, as Gary indicated, and yes, I was a student of his a long time ago in LASK. I'm just going to share my screen if I have the sharing powers. Is that possible? There we go. So I can't see the chat, so if at any time, if anybody has anything they want to share or say, or Gary, if you want to just pipe in, that is okay with me. Oh, this is not where I wanted to start. Escape. This is where I want to start. There we go. All right, so I do have to admit that I am a little bit nervous. It's been a while since I presented to a group outside of my own organization, so please bear with me. So yes, thank you and welcome to Reading for Reconciliation. As you may have heard already, my name is Amanda Nelson. And for today's session, description and goals, Gary went through that, but we'll try to keep on track. I do tend to overplan. I am a teacher by trade, so you got to be prepared just in case. And with that though, because I am a teacher, I love conversation and I love when things fold out organically. So if the presentation doesn't go as planned, I do like to follow the lead of participants and engage in conversation. So I welcome you to interrupt me anytime to ask a question. If you write in the chat, just know that I can't see the chat as I'm presenting. So we will hopefully have time at the end for any questions and sharing of our learning today. So just a little bit about myself. I am a mom of 4, and those are my 4 lovely children right there. My oldest is 16 and my 2 middle are 12 and almost 11. And my youngest is 2. So we are a very, very busy family. I grew up mostly in Saskatchewan. I did spend some time in British Columbia when I was fairly young, and then in Yorkton, and then back to Marcelin and Lease area, which is about an hour north of Saskatoon. I am Métis, as Gary indicated. My ancestry, my roots are in the Red River Métis settlement, as well as Batoche. And I do have ancestry of British, French, German, and Swedish descent. So that's just a little bit about myself. So before we begin, I just like to share my own expression and gratitude of and appreciation of the land that I'm currently located in. I am presenting from Warman, Saskatchewan, and Warman, Saskatchewan is located in Treaty 6 territory. And those are the traditional lands of the Cree, the Dakota, Stoney Nakoda, and Saulteaux peoples, and it's also the homeland of the Métis. I wish to start my presentation in a good way, and by doing that, I feel like expressing my gratitude and appreciation for the land is the best way to do it. Land acknowledgements are an act of reconciliation and are inspired from practice some nations engaged in when visiting other nations' territories. I hope that you will think about creating a personalized land acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation for the future. Today, I also like to share that I grew up on a farm near Marcelin. So the picture there is my dad and my youngest son Nolan. And these are just some images that are near and dear to me. And We All Go Back to Land is an excellent book too, a little bit more about reconciliation and land acknowledgements, and making them personalized and really honoring that act of reconciliation instead of it becoming a rubber stamp. So with that, we'll continue the conversation. So this is just how I'm breaking down the presentation today. We are actively going to be thinking about reconciliation. We're going to be thinking about our reading journey. We're going to be thinking about Indigenous authors and texts, and thinking about what book or text is a good fit in our reconciliation journey. So to start off the presentation, talking about reconciliation and literature, I referred to one of my favorite authors, Joanna Piscanu, for Taking Back Our Spirits, and this is a quote from her text. Indigenous peoples have believed in the healing power of language and story since time immemorial. And today's, I have a thing in the way, Indigenous writers continue to apply this belief to the creation of works of literature in theater in English. Indigenous peoples have appropriated the language and literary practice of the colonizers, which they used to expose the consequences of imperial policies on their people. However, Indigenous literature is not merely an expose of past and present injustices. Indigenous people have learned that the creative process has restorative powers. Today's Indigenous writers use the power of narrative and drama to heal themselves and their people from the trauma that colonial practices have inflicted. So first thing when we're thinking about reconciliation is we need to understand what reconciliation is. So this is where I invite you for a few seconds to think about what reconciliation is. Don't cheat, don't look it up on Google. You may also have heard of it pronounced as reconciliation. And I'm curious as to what reconciliation is to you. So take a moment, anything that comes to mind, really just jot it down, put it in the chat. If you want to share, you can go ahead and share if you have the unmuting powers, that is. And Gary, if you're hosting, could you please read what's in the chat?
Yes, I will do that.
Thank you.
People are thinking.
Oh, good.
Repairing harm and moving forward together, rebuilding relationships, healing, forgiveness, healing, and Wakatwin and Win. Again, phys ed background, asking questions, listening and learning. I'm a whole language student, so
Nice.
You be the judge.
So we'll just wait a couple more seconds and we'll move on to the next slide. Those are all fabulous responses. I love that
coming together and moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Restoring relationships.
Okay, I am going to move, but we will come back to it because when we think about reconciliation, just as the chat showed, there are so many ways to define reconciliation or reconciliation. But basically, during and after the course of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's work, it became evident that reconciliation means different things to different people, communities, organizations, and institutions. And that came from a report by Inspire in 2021. And from that, we can obviously glean that defining reconciliation is very difficult, but it is also indicative of an ongoing process of establishing and maintaining respectful relationships, and that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to reconciliation. That reflects the definition too, and how it differs for each of us, what reconciliation is and what it looks like. So for an important part of reconciliation, it requires action. So I do have two pictures from schools from my school division, Prairie Spirit, just different examples of what kind of work we engage in reconciliation, how it looks differently in each of our schools, because not one community is the same as the other. And even within our schools and our school community, for our students, reconciliation can mean different things depending on our learners and their backgrounds and what age they are. And from there, we can draw different ways to enact reconciliation. And last but not least, truth is a vital component of reconciliation. And without truth, there is no reconciliation. So I borrowed that from Jesse Venti from his book Unreconciled, which came out earlier this fall in 2021. To borrow another line from Jesse, he says truth and reconciliation are like married to each other and that you can't separate the two. So now that we got a working idea of what reconciliation is and what it means to us, we can start thinking about enacting reconciliation. So thinking about reading as an act of reconciliation. So if we are thinking of reading as an act of reconciliation, then we need to be aware of the responsibilities that we have as readers. So this past weekend, I had the privilege to listen to Jesse Venti. He was one of the keynote speakers at the ASCO Literature Festival that Saskatchewan Aboriginal Writers Circle, they put on twice a year. And these are some of the key understandings that I got from Jesse's sharing of his knowledge. So our job as readers is to discern and unpack stories. So we need to be mindful about what is the intent of the stories and who are the authors. Understanding the purpose, the intent, and the context of the stories together, and then unpacking that. We also need to be mindful and understand the power of stories and the need to humanize stories. And then we can't separate those. So these are just some key things as readers, and if we're using reading as an act of reconciliation, to keep in our minds as we go forward. Gary, if there's any questions in the chat at any time, please let me know. So parts of reconciliation, not only our responsibilities as readers, but understanding that relationship piece, which Winston, he touched on in his presentation. So relationships are kind of like the foundation of reconciliation. So it's all about mending relationships, building relationships, renewing relationships. It's always an act, it's ongoing. There's never just a point that you're going to arrive. And with that, we need to think about building the relationships, maintaining them. So this quote I took from Aubrey Jean Hanson's book, Literatures, Communities, and Learning, Conversations with Indigenous Writers. And she connects relationships and community and the context of the two. So Indigenous literatures do not exist apart from the real world. Creative work connects communities and contexts. Texts and communities affect each other. Communities and contexts, social, political, cultural, shape and contribute to literary writings. Texts influence the communities and contexts to which they arise as they contribute to readers' understandings of people, events, concepts, social dynamics, and history. Reading Indigenous literatures entails a responsibility to recognize and respond to the relationships between text and context. So engaging in relationships, not just with people, but with our literatures and any type of literatures really. And we'll talk about the different types of different forms of literatures in a moment. So I just thought that bounced off nicely from what Jesse shared this past weekend. All right, so now is the time that you get to do some thinking and some writing. And don't worry, it's not like an essay or anything like that. So when we're thinking about reading as an act of reconciliation or for reconciliation, we're going to map out our reading journey. So we're going to start with reflecting first, so understanding where we are coming from. And from there, we're going to acknowledge our intentions or intention. So really finding out what it is that we need to do, our work, where we need to go forward in our path of reconciliation. How will we get there? So identifying which books, authors, or genres will help you to get forward and move forward and continue in your journey to reconciliation. And once you arrive, once you meet your goal, where will you go after that? So thinking about your next steps as well. Oops, that's not the button. All right, so this is where I invite you to grab a pen, a pencil, a marker, a highlighter, anything that you have that you can write. If it's digital, go for that too. I want you to think about the first time you read a text that was Indigenous. So notice I put Indigenous in quotation marks. Because this could be a story or a text that features Indigenous characters or content, but it doesn't necessarily have to be written by an Indigenous author. This is important. I invite you to think about anything. The first time in your memory that you could think of when you were introduced or you read an Indigenous text. Once you have that figured out, I invite you to think about the impact of that text. So what are your thoughts as you reflect on that memory, that experience? So I'll be quiet for a couple of moments. Okay, so I'm going to interrupt your thinking and reflecting time, just for the sake of time. I, of course, thought about this long and hard. I think this is very important. It really gets us to start digging deep where we are at and where we're going. For me, the first memory that pops up for me was when I was in grade 3. My teacher had us read the short story Panache by W.P. Kinsella, and that's where that image is there on the side there, the dancing outside. It comes from that anthology. And that was my first memory of reading a text that was Indigenous. So if you're unfamiliar with W.P. Kinsella and the dancing outside short stories, what I can say about this experience as a Métis child, it really left me confused. Even reading the story as an adult, I can see why the story would be confusing to a lot of people, especially in this day and age when we know more. But back in the world of the early 90s, I don't really want to pinpoint my age, but I can take a guess. Back in the early 90s, there really wasn't too much available that was written by Indigenous authors. There were books out there and definitely better choices for grade 3. But this is what, when we're thinking about text and the impact of text and being intentional about what we choose to read either for ourselves or to our children or to our students or for teachers, we need to think about the impact it's going to have and what exactly the purpose of reading that text is. And sadly for a lot of us, especially older people, a lot of the texts that we have read or were introduced to as children, whether that's stories or cartoons, were told from a non-Indigenous perspective. And we'll be talking about what impact that can have and the effect that it can have on all learners, not just Indigenous students or Indigenous people, but everyone. I would love to say that this isn't the case today, that we don't have this representation of Indigenous peoples in literature, but that is sadly not true. So part of my work here is to help teachers navigate literature and finding out which books are a good fit for the classroom and which ones we should not engage in or introduce to our children and our students. Gary, is there anybody who has a comment or wants to share anything?
I don't have any comments right now, but I do have a quick question, and I'm going to ask about social media, because you talk about reflection and perspective. A lot of the social media we get involved with feeds us what we want to have instead of a diverse sort of interaction. So, we've just heard about some of the impacts of a Facebook, knowing that the other ones have that same power. Inside our brain, the closest thing looking inside our brain is our Google searches. So I guess with that in mind, what do you see the benefits and drawbacks of helping this journey with social media as we all use it?
Okay, so just to clarify, do you mean like if we're using social media as our main tool for information, for gathering information, what's the best way to navigate what is a good fit and what's not?
Yes. So what is Prairie Spirit School Division doing with social media in a good way? Like what's working, I guess?
So from social media, we predominantly use Twitter. So like, of course, many teachers have their own personal social media accounts. But as Winston alluded to, like sometimes there's a crossover, right, for your professional and your personal life. And for many of our teachers, their Twitter presence, a lot of tweeting about the work and reconciliation that they are doing in their classrooms and promoting the work that their schools and their students are engaged in. So I see that as a really good way to check into, like, be be mindful of who you're following. So if you want to engage in reconciliation or want to learn more, there are outstanding social media presence online for whatever social media platform that you prefer. I'm not really a Twitter person, but I do know like there's a ton of Indigenous academics, for example, writers that are on Twitter and have a huge Twitter presence. And that is a great way, if that's the at the moment in your lifestyle that you can engage in literature, is to pick up on those people that you can learn and grow from.
Okay,
Does that answer your question? Okay.
it does, because I'm really thinking of organizations, they could have that, you know, those check-in times to see how they are doing. And that's one way of doing it, of, you know, here's our goal but here's now our check-in, and a little bit of self-accountability too, that we're moving forward.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a great question. Thank you. So I do know for Prairie Spirit, we do have a handle or a hashtag that is hashtag PSSD reconciliation. So that's one way that our teachers check in and how our institution holds ourselves accountable for the work that we are trying to do and are committed to. Thanks, Gary. Okay. So now that we thought about the first text that really introduced us into what was supposed to be, for whatever intent that author or that filmmaker had, that was Indigenous, supposed to be an Indigenous perspective, whether it was or not, we're going to think about our reading journey as a whole. So you may be an avid reader and you may have a long list, but we're just going to do a really short time frame again. So this is kind of structured like a free fall write, where in this time, you just quickly jot down any text that you have viewed or that you've read or listened to that had Indigenous characters and content. Don't worry about the spelling. And if you can't remember the exact name of the title, but you have an idea, just write it down anyway. And same with the author. If you don't remember or worried about his spelling, don't worry about that. The point is to generate a working list in a short amount of time. And that will help us feed into the next steps of uncovering where we are in our reconciliation journey when it comes to reading. So text could be books, it could be children's books, it could be novels, graphic novels, fiction, nonfiction, etc. They could be magazines, newspapers, documentaries, podcasts, and movies, etc. So I will give you about 2 minutes just to quickly jot down, set a timer, and try to get as much as you can. So don't worry if these texts weren't authored by Indigenous peoples. I just want you to get that list just to see for comparative reasons further in our presentation. All right, timer is set for 2 minutes and go.
I'll maybe mention some from the chat here. Then from the ashes, go show the world, 3 feathers, education of Augie Marasti, clearing the plains, the inconvenient Indian, winter studies and summer rambles by Anna Bronwell Jameson, in search of Almighty voice, two-spirit journey, Mani Shakapi, the education, okay, 7 fires of Diane Knight, everything you wanted to know about Indians but were afraid to ask, 5 Little Indians by Michelle Good.
Perfect. All right, your next task. So yes, I'm really happy to hear Indigenous authored works. And our next task though is to circle which texts were created by Indigenous authors or artists. And if you're unsure, this is where I invite you to Google or to pause. Then after that, I want you to tally up how many Indigenous created or authored texts are on your list and how many are non-Indigenous. And then the final step is examining where you are and think about where you want to go. And we're going to look at a checklist of examining our titles that we picked or that we have read, and really asking ourselves the questions in order to see where we should go or where we are headed. So circle those texts if you know they're by Indigenous authors. If you're unsure, Google. And here's some questions to ask yourself about your list. If you find that the majority on your list are Indigenous authors, what you think about are the texts of the same genre? So if you notice that you're reading a lot of biographies or a lot of fiction, a lot of historical, nonfiction, that's a notice that you can make. If you find that the majority of your texts on the list are authored by non-Indigenous people, same thing. Are the texts the same genre? So looking for some commonalities there. After you've done that, I want you to think to yourself, were these texts required for a course or did you study it at school? And same thing with non-Indigenous authors. So were they required for a course or did you study it at school? Third thing is for Indigenous authored books is which text did you enjoy the most? So star those ones, the ones that you enjoyed the most. Or if your list is mostly non-Indigenous authored, I want you to start thinking about were these texts written in consultation with an Indigenous community or an organization? Or were they endorsed by an Indigenous community or organization? Which text sparks your curiosity for any Indigenous issue or issues, and which ones? So if you found that that you were reading a lot about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, Two-Spirit, peoples and issues, maybe that's a text that was so to you want to learn more. For a non-Indigenous author, did you notice any biases or stereotypes portrayed in the text? That one might require a second read through. And again, which text did you learn most from? For non-Indigenous authors, is there an Indigenous author text that is of the same genre or the same topic that you read in place of that or to complement that text? Last, do you have a favorite Indigenous author that would help you also to formulate a plan going forward? Oops. I'll go back to the slide. So these are great questions to ask yourself as you reflect on your reading, both for Indigenous authors and for non-Indigenous authors. And we'll get into more deeper questions and considerations further in the presentation. So this will give you an idea of who you are as a reader, where your strengths are, where your gaps of learning could be. So if you find that you are learning lots about the treaties, for example, is there an area that maybe you could read into more to complement that learning? Or maybe you found out that you really enjoy different types of fiction and finding out more different types of authors of different genres within fiction. That's a good place to start too. So this list here, these questions are really to start getting you thinking about which pathway you want to go down or which direction you want to take in your reading. So your next steps, what's your intention? So we're coming back to that intentionality piece, the intention, and thinking about our list, thinking about what we have read, thinking about the authors, and of course the genre, the content. Where do you want to go? What will you need to learn or read more about? So thinking about yourself and your journey, what you do know, what you don't know, or maybe you don't know what you don't know. Those are all ways to investigate and to think about planning for your next steps and which books can help you do that, because there are a lot of books. And ultimately, like, what interests you? Just because your spouse or your partner, your friends are reading a book and they really enjoy it, but maybe you're not a poetry person, that's okay. There's tons of books out there that will meet your interests as well. So it's really important to know yourself and know what interests you, because as an English teacher, I know what it's like when people pick up a book and they really aren't enjoying it, they're not liking it, but they're sticking with it, and it just makes their life kind of miserable. Their reading life is miserable. So I really encourage you to do you, basically. All right, so now that we know or have an insight about where we've been, we have some thinking to do about Indigenous author texts and non-Indigenous author texts. Now we're going to be thinking about Indigenous authors and texts, and of course, what to watch out for. Gary, I'm going to ask, how much time do I have left on this presentation?
It is 2:47, 13 minutes.
13 minutes, okay. So I did have a piece of a podcast by Daniel Heath Justice, who's featured in Rosanna Deerchild's podcast on CPC Unreserved. I do encourage you to check it out. He speaks on that podcast about 11 minutes long. It's why Indigenous literatures matter. And this is his book. I'm not sure if you can see it, but his book is excellent and a good primer if you are seriously interested in learning about Indigenous literatures and why they matter. Definitely check out Daniel's book. And basically, Daniel speaks about the dangers, amongst other things too in this book, about the dangers that lie in stories and how we need to be mindful of the power the stories have. And when we choose the books, when we are being mindful and intentional, are we choosing books that are helping us grow, or are we choosing books that are perpetuating a stereotype or only one narrative? And often is a narrative that isn't even ours, but is voiced by non-Indigenous or colonial colonized thinking. So that's where it leads me to think about the danger of a single story. And if you've never listened to or watched this TED Talk, I encourage you to check out the danger of a single story. So when we look at the image on the left, in about the 1950s, something that was quite stereotypical and commonplace. When we think about the danger of a single story, we think about how a single story creates stereotypes and we create pictures that are untrue, they're incomplete. And that's what makes them so dangerous. When we refer back to your list and when you reflect on your reading list, if there is only one type of genre or one theme or one topic, or if you only have read one book by an Indigenous author, I encourage you to start reading. So even going onto social media and just checking into different or following different people on social media to really build up your repertoire of perspectives. So speaking of the danger of a single story, this is the danger of a single story if we are not mindfully selecting our texts, if we're not being intentional about what we read, and we're not doing our due diligence. So that responsibility that I shared with you earlier. So if reading is an act of reconciliation, then we should be mindful and intentional of which books we read. So this story comes from a book called A Broken Flute, the Native Experience in Books for Children. There's also a blog that you can search that they recommend books or they do a critical review of. And this is a story, a testimony from a person. And this is what she says. So Raven's story. My name is Raven. When I was in the 3rd grade, our class read The Courage of Sarah Noble. In this book, they said Indian people were savages and murderers. They chopped your head off and eat you alive, and that we were not really people. When the class put on the play for the whole school, the kids started calling me stinky and asking me how many people I've eaten. Nobody would play with me or even sit next to me in class. I felt so ashamed. Finally, I told my mother I didn't want to go back to school. So this book right here is an example of if we are not mindful in doing our due diligence and looking into the book, the danger that it can pose or hold to Indigenous peoples for stereotypes and misconceptions and what that does to people. And if we're really thinking about reconciliation, we're thinking about creating healthy, respectful relationships. And there are books out there that, well, unfortunately, negate that process. So again, going back to the story, the danger of a single story. So again, that's what the book looks like, A Broken Flute. So when we're thinking about perspective and considering perspective, it's really important to understand or to be mindful of when you're reading a text, whether it's for yourself or if you're a teacher or for your own children. or grandchildren. When we're thinking about perspective, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous authors, this is on page 69 of the book. So one of the more controversial questions in literature is who should be writing books that include characters or themes related to members of a particular ethnic, racial, or religious group. Those who prefer that such books be written from within communities perhaps justifiably fear exploitation, misrepresentation, or having their voices preempted. However, some non-Indians have written quality books about Native peoples, histories, and cultures, so it won't be argued here that only Native authors can write Native-themed stories. While many fine books are written by authors outside of the community who do their homework, the voice of an insider still offers a unique perspective that is, in many ways, a rare gift to young readers. We sometimes see stories from those who have married Native people, born Native children, been adopted into Native families, or know Native people who call them friend. Even more directly, we sometimes see stories by Native people, stories that have been passed down and reshaped to reflect family and personal histories. Indeed, books written by Native authors do not usually contain conventions that are typically used to signal the book as being about a Native character. For example, characters in the books written by Native authors don't speak in guttural English. They don't act like savages and they don't seem like mystical creatures. Rather, they are often eloquent speakers. But this eloquence may not fit the non-Native readers or publishers' expectations of how Natives speak, so they may reject the book as not being authentic enough, quote unquote. But on more subtle grounds, Indian writers have to do the research as well. A story from one's great uncle may actually be more authentic than anything written by someone with a PhD. A childhood experience may lend itself into a theme, even a whole story. Not everything crafted by Native writers will necessarily present the most popular or desirable or comfortable picture, even within their communities, certainly to the mainstream. Although each story will have the individual storyteller's own vision and voice, they are too compared to fulfill the responsibility. An outside researcher, however careful, who goes on to write a story based entirely on the written words, especially the words of another outsider, rather than the experiences, may craft a book that you would hesitate to share with children. However, these authors may unknowingly mimic misconceptions or stereotypes inherent in research material, and still others may whitewash history to make the non-Native audience more comfortable with issues like stolen land and forced assimilation. So when we're thinking about perspective, I invite and encourage everyone to think about those words from the Broken Flute. And this is a great book to help gain insights if you are interested in why we privilege Indigenous authors for some of the text choices that we have in our classroom. All right, so going off the notes from a Broken Flute, so suggestions for previewing a text. So these are some key things to look for as a starting point. When we're previewing a text or critically reviewing a text, there are different levels of engaging with the text under review. And this is just a really simple way to start that critical examination. So if the text is by an Indigenous author, does this author self-locate themselves? So do they say who they are? Do they identify where they're coming from, the communities that they're coming from? This is very important, and it's a way to recognize where someone is and to situate themselves and yourself with the author. For non-Indigenous authors, did the author work in consultation with an Indigenous community or organization? And is this text endorsed by Indigenous groups? Are there any stereotypical images if it's a children's storybook, or is the content representative of any stereotypes, misconceptions, biases? If anything, you can just check the book for any criticisms that already exist online. So you can Google the text, or you can search in the American Indians and Children's Literature blog, and there is the address at the bottom there. There's quite a number of reviews done, even though this is an American blog page and done by American academics. They do review some Canadian author texts as well. And it does save a lot of work for a lot of people to go in there and see where the criticisms lie and know if that text is problematic, and if so, where the problems are and how they can have conversations with other people or with students too about those texts. All right, so now we're going to think about what book or text is a good fit. This is the part where I thought we could all chime in together, and I can turn off my PowerPoint or just at least put it on the minimum screen. But before we do that, I invite you to revisit your intentions. So thinking again after learning what you just heard briefly in this brief presentation. So where is it that you want to go? And what will you need to learn or read more about? Again, your interests, and what authors have you heard about or have you read?
I have a question, Amanda, from Dennis Helmuth. Should we reconcile the dilemma of Indigenous literature written by identity conflicted authors? Example of Joseph Boyden.
So the thing that we need to be mindful of is what we know now is what we know, right? So Joseph Boyden was celebrated before his identity was put under scrutiny and then was revealed about what his actual background is. So before that all came into play, like Joseph Boyden was a celebrated author. So sometimes it's really hard to vet a person right away. But again, with Joseph Boyden, one of the things that outed him was his inconsistent self-location. So he was always ping-ponging back and forth between different nations and with Métis. So he was never consistent about who he was. So that raised some red flags right there. Usually if an author is self-identifying and saying who they are and where they are, that community can claim them back. So it's like, oh, like that person claims that they're from this community and of this nation, but we don't know that person. So something like what happened to Michelle Latimer earlier this year, that nation's not claiming them back, the community's not claiming them back. And that now what I see is going forward from like Joseph Boyden, Michelle Latimer, and now Prairie is that these practices are starting to pick up of that claiming back of the person who's claiming to be from a community or of a nation. So what I can offer is just do your due diligence, just check into those points that I offer. So checking into if a person is self-identifying, is locating, and if there's any weight behind it. And sometimes that weight is really hard to see and it plays out later. But just doing your due diligence in those areas until we know better is one way that we can ensure that we can be better. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you for that.
So this is our time right now just to talk about and share ideas for books and for book lists. So there are, like in my work, I've been in this position for about 2 years now in my role as the strategic facilitator in Indigenous perspectives, outcomes, and partnerships. And there's many book lists, and there's the exciting thing now is that Indigenous literature in Canada and the US is picking up. There's so many great authors and books being published nonstop, and there really is no excuse anymore to not read any great Indigenous author texts. So with that being said, if you have any suggestions or any author suggestions, please throw it in the chat. I do have some links to different book lists. So this one's for children's books from C to C, and it's by Ibby. They compiled this one, I believe, about 2 years ago. So it is recent. The nice thing about this list, though, is some of the books go back to the 90s, to the late 80s. So like Thomas King, for example, one of his books from the early 90s is in this book. It's recommended in this list. And I believe with our Winston McLean presentation, there were a few book suggestions given out in the areas of commerce and economy and for employment. So those are, that's awesome too. I did give some academic recommendations, but I know like academia is not everyone's bread and butter, which is fine. I'm a grad student, so it just happens to be mine right now. If you're looking for any suggestions, really, I have lots of books here too, and this is the time where I invite everybody else in the crowd to shine in. For a young girl. Ooh. This is a great book. And it's actually a series, The Case of the Missing Auntie. So it's the Mighty Muskrat's Mysteries. So there's a series, I believe 3 of them are out now, if not more. So if your girl is into mysteries, this is a great example. There's also Joseph Bruchac has a new book out called Res Dogs, and it's written in prose. It's really, really good. I'll put it in the chat here. Res Dogs by Joseph. So in Res Dogs, it takes place well right now in our current situation with COVID-19. It's about a young girl who goes out to visit her grandparents on her home reservation in the United States, and her parents are at home. And what happens is it's a recap of like the whole 2020 shenanigans when the world just shut down, and she was stuck with her grandparents. And this dog mysteriously appears out of nowhere, kind of like the protector. And through the story, certain pieces are revealed, for especially for the American First Nations groups and their history. Some of it was revealed through there, like residential schools, and the 60s was revealed through there as well. So I do recommend the Res Dogs by Joseph Bruchac. Sounds very tuning. Like my sounds very tuning for the book.
I think your mic is with your hair, maybe. Yes. Sorry.
Is it good? No?
I think it might be better now. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's still tinny a bit, but that's okay.
Okay. Sorry. I do have other headphones, but I guess it's at the end of my presentation. Yes. Is there any other question? Oh, I will just not move my head. How about that? I did notice a comment at the top here for reconciliation. So for reconciliation, is something settlers need to do. Decolonizing is for Indigenous to do, and that's a really good point. There's varying perspectives on reconciliation and the role for Indigenous people and for non-Indigenous peoples. So that is something to be aware of, is that there's different perspectives and opinions just based on who you are and where you're coming from. But very good point. I encourage everybody to think about decolonizing. There is a great decolonizers handbook available online that you can use for your institutions as well. You can actually do decolonizing groups and workshops. So suggest for everyone to look into that. Okay, so
thank you very much. Like I again, a great session on really being critical readers and really thinking about what we're reading and reflecting and before we get into the author. So I appreciate the presentation. It seems the last 2 presentations, so much learning about just being better learners as we go. And so and to be self-critical, and that what are we reading? What are we feeding ourselves? So that's greatly appreciated. And I know that the teaching methods of asking the questions first, so we all have to reflect, doesn't always work the greatest in Zoom, but it gave us the time to reflect, and that because we all had to write something down. There's a bit of silence where we sit there for a bit, but then we put down our information. So I appreciate that too, that sometimes that's hard to do as a presenter, to give that time, but it's appreciated so we can continue to be a part of the conversation.
You're welcome.
Yeah, well,